People can see?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, what I'm going to present tonight is a history on America and the Pacific, the beginning of the dialogue. And it's prompted by the fact that we have, well, the psychiatric patients temporarily occupying the White House and the Executive Office building have recently suggested that Japan abrogate Article 9 of its 1946 Constitution. And if people aren't familiar with that, it states that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces as well as other war potential will never be maintained. Now, of course, the aim of these lunatics is to again militarize Japan in order to do the bidding of the British oligarchy in pursuit of Samuel Huntington's perpetual warfare wet dream. The ultimate target, of course, being China. Now, this underscores the necessity of implementing the measures called for by Lyndon LaRouche in his recent book, Earth, the Next 50 Years. Now, the title of the lead article in that book is The Dialogue of Eurasian Civilizations, Earth's Next 50 Years. In the opening passage, LaRouche warns of the onrushing threat to human civilization due to the current failure to undertake such a serious dialogue. A dialogue of civilizations is not a can't we just get along approach. In pursuit of nice feeling states, particularly by boomers, they will gloss over substantive issues. Ecumenicism is reduced to the lowest common denominator of mutual agreement. Rather, as LaRouche states, we require the successful approach used by Cardinal Nicholas Acusa in conducting the Council of Florence, which created the 15th century Renaissance. Central for today was Cusa's proposal for a peace of faith between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faiths in his De Pace Fidei. And what is that? LaRouche says it's the quality of agape expressed by the Socrates of Plato's Republic, is the same agape of the Christian apostle Paul's 1 Corinthians 13, and of the constitutional principle of Leibniz's pursuit of happiness, as found in the 1776 U.S. Declaration of Independence and the subsuming preamble of the 1787-89 U.S. Federal Constitution, unquote. Now, the purpose of this class is to provide an outline of the history of America's unique role among the Asian nations of the Pacific Rim, beginning in the early 19th century. And we will look at the positive role of America as played in promoting the best of Western civilization, the highest expression of that being the ideas embodied in the American Revolution in fostering, number one, human freedom from the shackles of oligarchism, and two, its corollary, freedom over nature, development of science and technology. Also, we have to examine the failures of that early dialogue of cultures and civilizations in order to correct them today. Now, just as the current history of the noosphere demands that the United States lead the world to adopt Lyndon LaRouche's new Bretton Woods system, the circumstances of the history of the 18th century demanded the success of the American Revolution and adoption of those ideas globally. As Benjamin Franklin understood, the failure of that mission would have meant a dark age for the human race. The history of America's activity in the Pacific is the history of the battle over the idea of the nature of man against the evil of the British Empire. The battle was fought both internationally and internally in the United States itself. The battle continues today. The negative, evil side of this is expressed by the following quote: "East is east and west is west." People have heard this expression? Okay. Well, maybe this generation hasn't heard it, but previous ones have heard it a lot. It's probably the most quoted phrase from this terrible, rotten British poet, so-called Rudyard Kipling. And this is part of his Barracks Ballads, God help us all. And this epitomizes the enemy. That East, the Occidental, the Asians, they are completely different from the white man. West, the West. Right? And that is basically the idea, that is biologically determined. Now, if you look at this NASA photo, this is the Pacific. And you don't see much land. It's a big place. If you look at the bottom part here, you see Antarctica, which was actually proven to be a continent by an American deployed by the Navy on a scientific expedition in the late 1830s, early 1840s by the name of Wilkes. It was a major, actually went all over the South America and Eastern Asia. And my investigation of this matter, began in the wake of the massacre which occurred at Beijing's Tiananmen Square in June of 1989. And today we know much more about the internal political manipulations of that event by such people as Winston Lord, who I know and would undoubtedly like the name Lord Winston Lord, who was the Chinese ambassador at the time, and the Western oligarchy. And this is a picture of that demonstration outside the Forbidden City on Tiananmen Square. And at the time, seeing these Chinese students construct their own version of the Statue of Liberty and singing Beethoven's Ode to Joy provoked me to investigate the origin of those very American ideas. I started by looking at the father of the First Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen. And no matter what political flavor you might be in China, from the period of the revolution in 1911 of Sun Yat-sen to today, everyone in China is forced to formally recognize that fact, but have been kept ignorant of the content and history of his ideas, particularly on the mainland. In 1957, the People's Republic of China published a collection of speeches by Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and other communist Chinese leaders commemorating Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And the following is from the short biography on Dr. Sun, included in that book. It says, between 1878 and 1883, Dr. Sun lived with his mother in Honolulu and attended a church school. The education he received there was of the colonial type, but the struggles waged by the people against their colonial overlords in the Hawaiian Islands had already left their marks on this young mind. In later years, he reportedly exposed and condemned in speeches and writings the annexation of the Philippine and Hawaiian Islands by American imperialism in 1898. Well, that's a bunch of lies, and it's based on ideological drivel. Not unlike today's boomers who prefer the comfort of glossing over history instead of examining and dealing with the hard truths. Now, after 6 months of extensive research, my findings were published in a series of articles in New Federalists entitled Sun Yat-sen and the American Roots of China's Republican Movement. I had not only proved Zhou Enlai and company to be either wrong or liars, but in fact those Hawaiian missionaries had been directly responsible for the education of Sun Yat-sen in the American system and had played a critical role in aiding Sun Yat-sen in establishing the Republic of China in 1911. And when that revolution was successful, actually Sun Yat-sen was in the United States at the time. And he stated, quote, "To work out the salvation of China is exclusively a duty of our own. But as the problem has recently involved a worldwide interest, we, in order to make sure of our success, must appeal to the people of the United States, in particular for your sympathy and support, either moral or material, because you are pioneers of Western civilization in Japan, because you are a Christian nation, because we intend to model our new government after yours. Above all, because you are the champions of liberty and democracy. We hope we may find Lafayette's among you." Unquote. Of course, referring to the Marquis de Lafayette, who was critical in getting the French to support the revolution in America. Now, it was this grouping of several generations of missionaries in the Pacific which was the critical element in stopping the Pacific Ocean from turning into a British lake. Rather big lake, but nonetheless a British-owned lake. And some of those American missionaries are remembered and honored to this day as heroes in their adopted Asian nations, yet are virtually unknown to Americans. So, in the beginning, when did people living in America, this is the question, when did people living in America first consider sending missionaries abroad to Asia? Anyone hazard a guess? 1850s. Any other guesses? Any knowledge? 1650. Is that what you said? Yeah. 30 years after the Mayflower landed at Mayflower. Well, that's close. It was 1721 when Cotton Mather gave a sermon to a short-lived missionary society where he called for the establishment of a missionary expedition to be sent to India. Of course, this is before the revolution, of course. Now, in his essay shown here, at least the cover page, To Do the Good, or Bonifacius, Mather says, quote, "The world has, according to the computation of some, about 700 millions of people now living in it. What an ample field among all these to do good upon, whether the things be of a spiritual importance or of a temporal." Unquote. Now, Mather sets the foundation, the religious and philosophical foundation for the new American Republic. And his influence is profound and can't be overstated. Benjamin Franklin is a prime example, who said everything he learned in philosophy, he learned from this book by Mather. And it guided his actions through his life. Now, the organization we're going to be concerned with and examining is this one, the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. It's just to give you an idea of who some of the people involved in this operation are. There's Elias Boudinot on the left, who was a member of the Continental Congress from 1777. He was president of that Congress in 1783, signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the war with the British Empire. Then he was a congressman from New Jersey, 1789 to 95, director of the U.S. Mint, and most importantly, he was the mentor and father, if you will, of his adopted son, Alexander Hamilton. John Quincy Adams, who undoubtedly you've heard of before, one of the key intellectuals of the and leaders of the United States in its history, son, of course, and the son of the founder, one of the founders and presidents of the United States, John Adams, author of the Monroe Doctrine, president elected in 1824, thus ensuring during the success of that election the survival of the Republic. And he was an avid promoter of science, industry, and Hamiltonian economics. John Jay, here, drafted the Constitution of the State of New York. He was Chief Justice of New York, 1776 to 79. He was a member and president of the Continental Congress in 1778. He was in charge of foreign affairs for the Confederation government in the 1780s and 90s. Also minister to Spain in 1779. A member of the commission that negotiated the treaty with Great Britain. And he was, of course, co-author with Hamilton and Madison of the Federalist Papers, the arguments that were published for the adoption of the various amendments of our Constitution. And he was appointed the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Was then later elected to the governorship of New York and signed into law the act abolishing slavery in New York. And last but not least, here is Theodore Frelinghuysen, who is son of a Dutch-American Revolutionary War leader, Chancellor of New York University, later Rutgers in Brunswick, New Jersey. He's the U.S. Senator from New Jersey in 1829 to 35, President of the American Bible Society, along with James Fenimore Cooper. In fact, they raised $40,000 for the Hawaiian mission. And in 1844, he was the vice presidential candidate on the Whig Party with Henry Clay. Now, here's the prime movers, in particular, the Morse family. The son over here, Samuel F.P. Morse, is the inventor of the telegraph, and he was an artist, a painter, and he spent much time abroad, and he painted a famous portrait of Lafayette, and he spent a lot of time abroad in Europe, and as all good Republican painters do, was a spy for American intelligence. And Jedediah Morse, his father, was the key personality behind the creation of the ABM, the American Foreign Missions. And Jedediah Morse led the 1905 battle over who would become the chair of the Hollis Chair of Philosophy at Harvard University against the Boston Brahmins, who had put forward their new movement, the Unitarian movement, as a cat's paw to get rid of this, what they considered terrible philosophy of the Mathers, Winthrops, and so forth. 1805. The Unitarians attacked the concept of the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, i.e. the Filioque. This is not to say that all Unitarians are bad, but this philosophy stinks. Ellery Channing, one of the leaders of the Boston Unitarians, said, quote, "There is one God, and Jesus Christ is a being distinct from and inferior to God," unquote. Therefore, Jesus is just a slob, like the rest of us. And this is a direct assault on the Bonifacius ideas put out by Mather of this Augustinian concept of Christianity and human identity, and the idea of acting in the imitation of Christ. You can be a good guy. You can do good things. You can go by the LaRouche table once in a while and give them money. But, you don't really have a mission. You're not really judged by history or God. Because who are you to know? You merely have the ability to have faith and belief. Now, as a result, Morse established that as the result of losing the battle over the Hollis Chair at Harvard, he created and established the Andover Theological Seminary as a rival to Harvard in Cornwall, Connecticut. And this was the base of operation for American Republicans to launch this international missionary project that changed history. And the mission was civilize the heathens and stop the domination of the British Empire. And we'll go through exactly what that means. The ecumenical bond of the Congregational churches, the Presbyterian, and the Dutch Reform that was behind the ABCFM became a model for later missionary operations. The first meeting that they drafted an address to the Christian public that stated, "The Lord is shaking the nations. His friends in different parts of Christendom are roused from their slumbers, and unprecedented exertions are making for the spread of divine knowledge and conversion of the nations. We have yet those exertions to make, which comport with the Savior's emphatical directions for promoting the great object for which he came down from heaven and labored and suffered. Is there then, in those who are favored with the gospel, the same mind that was in Christ when he freely gave his blood for the redemption of men?" From the beginning, the ABCFM, these Republican clergymen and their supporters, understood their task was to oppose the evil of the British Empire by organizing internationally for these ideas of the inalienable rights of man. On June 20th, 1812, 2 days after the United States had declared war on Great Britain, the ABCFM was incorporated in the state of Massachusetts, thereby giving it the ability to be a national organization with the financial mechanisms to organize abroad. Now, later in 1824, Jedediah Morris supported the election of John Quincy Adams with the release of his book, The Annals of the American Revolution. Now, Morris was the leading American theologian at the time. He wrote that British society is divided into, quote, king, nobility, and people. Their system, therefore, has for its basis social distinctions and recognizes not only the justness and propriety of those distinctions, but also the separate rights and privileges which appertain to these different and artificial classes. The attempts to maintain and preserve their separate rights and privileges. The basis of their system is the inequality, and the basis of ours is the equality of mankind in their social character and relations, as well as in their natural rights. Their system is designed to maintain and regulate an unnatural, unequal state of social order and social rights. Our system establishes and regulates social order upon the natural rights of man, unquote. So you'll not hear that coming out of the mouths of today's Pat Robertsons and Jerry Falwell. So, the first object, when we're dealing with Asia, or the Pacific, is the Native Americans. Are they to be citizens of the Republic, or are they to be treated as, at best, noble savages? Now, this is a map that outlines the various missions that were set up by the ABCFM. There's 13 of them that particularly that go all the way up from New England. This is, of course, the frontier into the interior over some period of time up into the northwest. All right? Now, the policy of the ABCFM towards Native Americans was a continuation of the policy adopted by George Washington to incorporate them into the Republic. In fact, the Congress issued money for some time to allow that to occur. There, the ABCFs, if you look at the breakdown of, you can't really see this too well. These are all this is basically the deployments of the ABCFM during this period 1810 to 1860. It's basically about 1,200 some odd people. One half of the total deployment in 1842 was in North America for the North American Indian population. Now, how best to educate Native Americans? Well, let's take the example of the Cherokee. As you will see, this is the hallmark of the ABCFM, what they did here. And it is their grappling with the problem of language. From the scientific standpoint that Percy Shelley talks about, how do you transmit the highest ideas concerning the profound ideas of man and nature? Now, if you look how it was done, we luckily had this man, Sequoyah, a member of the Cherokee Nation, who developed the talking leaves, or the 86 letters of the Cherokee alphabet. In 1821, this was adopted by the Cherokee Nation. With this system, it only took 2 weeks for a Cherokee to become literate in his own oral and written language. Samuel Worcester of the ABCFM, important guy, created the printing fonts by which they could publish in their own language. So the Cherokee Phoenix was born. The weekly newspaper of the Cherokee Nation, published in Georgia from 1828 to 34, and it was run by a Cherokee, Elias Boudinot, named after the Elias you saw earlier, who was trained at Andover. And the ABCFM brought in modern agriculture, housing, clothing, and so forth. 1827, the Cherokee adopted a written constitution declaring themselves a sovereign nation. And you'll see this a lot. A lot of these Indian nations, rather than be incorporated, the ABCFM would strive to keep them independent at the periods where the administration at that time was corrupt. They would be better off being independent at that point than being incorporated into the nation. And we'll see why. So the Cherokee Indians posed a threat. Well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Cherokee adopted this written constitution, and it was seen by some as a threat to the slaveocracy of the South. The state of Georgia, in particular, the Supreme Court of that state, said that the Indians, Native Americans, could not hold property titles. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled against the Cherokees. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law, giving the President, Andrew Jackson, the power to negotiate removal of all Native Americans east of the Mississippi River. And in 1831, the following year, John Quincy Adams revisited this case before the Supreme Court and got it reversed, right, in favor of the Cherokees. Now, what happened is that Jackson didn't care what the Supreme Court said, much like Judge Taney later during the Civil War. The missionaries, so Jackson began this removal of the Native Americans. Missionaries were arrested. Henry Carey actually held a fundraiser in Philadelphia to support the Cherokees during this time. But Andrew Jackson was a notorious Indian killer. It was well known. He was hated and despised by none other than Davy Crockett, who was a fellow Tennessean, who Jackson had lied to him about certain Indian massacres that occurred against white folk, and got Davy Crockett and a bunch of other people to go out and kill a lot of Indians. Why? Because they wanted the land. They wanted to expand the plantations in Tennessee. And once Davy Crockett realized that, he spent the rest of his life trying to unseat this guy from political office. He was elected to Congress, much to the chagrin of Jackson and his cohorts. So you have the Trail of Tears, where there is forced removal of the Cherokee Nation. 12,000 Cherokee are forced to travel 800 miles on foot over about 3 or 4 different routes. 4,000 of them died on the way of famine and disease, about a third of the nation. From 1830 to 1840, more than 60,000 Native Americans were forcibly removed west. The other projects of the ABCFM is the Northwest, and where you have the tete-a-tete between the ABCFM missionaries and the company being the Hudson Bay Company of the British, based in Vancouver, Washington. Now, in 1818, there was a treaty between the U.S. and the British which left the future of the Northwest Territory up in the air, in legal limbo. The Hudson Bay Company ran that region, which you see here, this area. You can see the territory goes way up there. Right? The Hudson Bay Company ran the region. They brought in Jesuit agents to control the Indian population. They learned a few things from the French in Quebec. And they pitted one tribe against all other tribes. One against all. And they had a monopoly of trade in the region based on hunting for pelts. They forbade even the selling of agricultural implements to the natives. So that was their fixed economy. 1836, the ABCFM sends missions to the Northwest headed by Marcus and Narcissus Whitman, pictured over here. They established operations in what today is Walla Walla, Washington, and in Idaho. In 1837, Whitman returns to the east, meets with a number of people, including President Tyler, in Washington, to get the go-ahead, which he more or less does, to create this Oregon Trail migration. He's got to get people out to this region to offset the balance of the company run by the British. The idea basically was to establish forts along this route, generally this route, every 100 miles. There would be stations of supply and protection for people migrating to the northwest. And what they did with the Native Americans is that they taught them modern agriculture. They introduced the potato into to the Nez Perce in Idaho. That's where the famous Idaho potato comes from, its origin. And the idea was to, and actually Narcissus taught classical music at their station in Walla Walla. In 1847, in the midst of a measles epidemic, the company organized an, quote, Indian massacre, unquote. And the Whitmans and 10 others were assassinated in their compounds. All of a sudden, a Jesuit bishop showed up at the murder site, went into the cabin, and emerged with a vial of liquid, claiming that it was being used to murder the Indians who had been dying of measles. And it was known that the company did this, and pamphlets were written furiously about it. In fact, the head of the Hudson Bay Company in Vancouver, Washington, resigned by the guy named Mackenzie because of this. He was disgusted by what the British had done, and he decided he would become an American. So, the international operations of the ABCFM are shown here. I don't know if people can clearly see it. These are regions in green where there are missions established, right? Including from the Zulus throughout the Middle East, India, Ceylon. The three that we're interested in are Hawaii, right here, where the establishment, which was because of what they did, were involved in the establishment of the first Chinese Republic, and keeping Hawaii independent of British rule, and the opening up of Japan and the modernization of Japan here. Ending Japan's isolation, developing Japan as a modern nation and as a bulwark against the British in Asia. And third, we're going to look at Siam and how it was kept free, the only nation in Asia to never be dominated by a colonial power. So, first we're going to examine the strategic importance of Hawaii. This is from a congressional hearing in the 1890s. This gives you an idea. All those red stars are British naval bases, right? All throughout, from Africa through India, of course, down under, Australia, New Zealand, in Asia, China, of course, and over in the Atlantic, Africa, Canada, the Caribbean. There's only one star there on the entire west coast of North and South America. And that's because of the election of Polk, who promised never to give up this territory to the British, which he swore he would do, got into office, and the lying son of a bitch gave it to the British. And then started the Mexican-American War. And that is why we have a British base first at Vancouver Island, and then over in Victoria Island, and then over in Vancouver later. So it was a long road to hoe for the British to get from here anywhere else across the Atlantic. And that was the importance. This compares the naval fleets of the British in the Atlantic to the United States. And if anything, it's underestimated as to the ratio between the U.S. and the British Empire. Yeah. Why? Because of the Americans. This is a little later than the period we're talking about 70 years later. But this gives you an idea of what the British were up to. You look at Hawaii from a geographical standpoint, it's smack dab middle in the Pacific Ocean. Right? It's 2,000 miles in either direction to the nearest mainland. Right? And much further if you're going to Australia or China, right? The closest being the United States itself. Right? So strategically, it's very important. If you're going to have naval operations of trading or military, Hawaii is strategically located. So this is a painting of that was done by Samuel B. Morse, and it was done on October 1819, the night before Hiram and Sybil Bingham sailed from Boston Harbor on their way to Hawaii. And there were two key events that occurred in Hawaii 5 months before their ship, the Thaddeus, arrived in Honolulu. Number one, King Kamehameha died. And number two, it was the abolition of the kapu system, which I'll explain. Now, the earthly paradise of the noble savages, as portrayed in such fiction as James Michener's book Hawaii and the subsequent movie, these romantic images of the native population, of benevolent pagans and so forth, is a lot of bullshit, to use a technical historical term. The Hawaiian population had more than 40,000 gods. They had the kapu laws. These were basically the traditional laws of the Hawaiians, which meant to violate any of these kapus meant instant death to the violator. An example is a woman eating in the presence of men. Allowing your shadow to cross the shadow of a chief meant you were instantly clubbed to death by the entourage surrounding the chief. So this gives you a different idea of clubbing in Honolulu. So these benevolent pagans practiced infanticide, human sacrifice was common, and they lived in filth and fleas. The big problem with fleas. You know, you see these romantic Hollywood movies, everybody's out on the beach and it's beautiful and the food's falling off the trees and, you know, everybody's happy. You know, it ain't how it was. Ain't how it was. Yes, killing babies. Now this is a NASA shot of the main Hawaiian Islands, and to give you an idea of the place a little bit, these are the two missions. One was set up in Honolulu, on Oahu Island, and the other in Maui. Now Kamehameha, who I mentioned, was the chief who had united all of the islands between 1796 and 1810, and with the help of two American sea captains who made the final arrangements to consolidate Kamehameha's power to control the islands against the British, because the British had announced their intentions to make Hawaii part of the British Empire. This is Captain Vancouver, and call them by their British name, the Sandwich Islands, named after the Earl of Sandwich, who was a notorious gambler, card player, who didn't have time to eat a formal sit-down meal and would slap meat between two slices of bread, hence the term sandwich. Now in May of 1819, on his deathbed, Kamehameha whispered his final instructions to his favorite wife, Kahumanu. God, I can't pronounce Hawaiian names. Kahamanu. And this is a very important and clever woman. She took control of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and 2 weeks before Bingham arrived, she outlawed the kapu. The British representatives on Hawaii denounced the arrival of the U.S. missionaries to the Hawaiians as an American political operation. It's completely true. Now, the British attempted to import a crazy radical sect from France of Catholics to offset and drive out the Americans and hence all the missionaries. And the U.S. naval captain in Honolulu at the time, Captain A.P. Capesbury Jones, stated, quote, "I happen to know something of the origin of the Catholics attempting to establish themselves in Oahu. It is the work of the British agent in Honolulu to overthrow the American missionaries. That man did not conceal his sending to Europe for Catholic missionaries. He speaks of it openly, that a short time would be sufficient to expel all other missionaries," unquote. So Hiram Bingham successfully argued to the Queen and stopped the British Catholic operation, so-called Catholic operation. Captain Bletcher of the British frigate then threatened to hang Hiram Bingham. And there were several attempts to assassinate him, including one elaborate scheme using cannon bombardment from the water. Now, the Queen converted the royal family to Christianity after Sybil Bingham had nursed her dying mother back to health. That meant the entire kingdom was open to conversion to Christianity. But again, how do you do it? They don't even speak the same language. Here is the solution. This is the front page of the journals, the memoirs of Reverend Robert Morrison, who was the son of a Scottish farmer. He became a member of the London Missionary Society to China. In 1807, to China for the native population to be taught how to read or write. An example is the slaves in the South in the United States before the Civil War. You would be killed if you taught a slave how to read or write. Even after World War II, in India, it was illegal to teach Indians a skilled trade. One of our members who's dead, who was alive and in India at that time, a Canadian, was teaching Indians how to weld by night in the forests, in India, because it was illegal under the British government. So this is the problem. The Hawaiian Kingdom began adopting forms of the American government. They passed the Bill of Rights in 1839, which said, quote, "God hath made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth in unity and blessedness. God has also bestowed certain rights alike on all men and all chiefs, and all people of all lands. These are some of the rights which he has given alike to every man and every chief: life, limb, liberty, and the labor of his hands, and the products of his minds." They do make a distinction between people and chiefs, but there is a definite universality of humanity that is mentioned, not just to Hawaiians, but other people. The problem is there is sabotage from within the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. And what happened is that the Boston Brahmins, which is a nice name to describe a group of wealthy people in Boston who were dope pushers, opium specifically, they were able to get their man to head the ABCFM in 1932 when the corresponding secretary for the ABCFM died. They lobbied and got this brute, Rufus Anderson, to become the new corresponding secretary, because this is the person who deals with the entire international operation. What he did was he sacked the mission in Siam, in Thailand, sabotaged the Whitman, Oregon mission, refused to allow Hiram Bingham, after he had come back to the United States to visit after 21 years in Hawaii, to return to Hawaii. And he was emphatic that the ABCFM had to stop training natives in medicine, in law, in teaching, and other skills. And in fact, there's no need to even translate languages or to print them. Just expound the gospel orally. Spouting dogma. Right? This is the Christianity, so-called, of the fundies today. So Bingham, stranded back in the United States, met with the president of the ABCFM, Theodore Frelinghuysen, and issued a proposal called $1 a month for the heathen, which proposed to raise $24 million a year from 2/3 of the Christians in the United States, about 200,000 people, and targeting, quote, 150 million of the present East Indian subjects of Great Britain, unquote. He says that $300,000 a year, is, if used as economically and as successfully as mission expedition in the Sandwich Islands, will in 20 years extend the gospel in the sense that it has been in that nation to 1,200,000 of our fellow men. Now, what were the British doing in the Pacific? Briefly, China. Between 801 to 1820, the British had imported 50,000 chests of opium into China from India every year. They started the first Opium War to force China into buying more in 1839 and making other concessions as well. Mexico, California, September 1842, intelligence from the U.S. consulate in Mazatlan, Mexico, indicates that the British were preparing to seize California. 1839, this is, of course, the British in 1839 had been trying to convince Mexico to give Great Britain the California region to pay off its $50 million debt owed to whom? Barings Bank of London, right? Land for debt. That was the operation. So the Americans were aware of this. So after receiving this intelligence report, the head of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was based in Peru, Commander Thomas A.P. Catesby Jones, remember him, from Hawaii, orders the U.S. fleet to Monterey, California. He takes over the town, such as it is, but the British don't show up, and he leaves not too long after that. Hawaii, February 1843, the British warship Cranesford took military control of Honolulu, declared the Hawaiian Kingdom under the British Empire rule. And then after much intrigue, the British finally forfeited Hawaii to independent rule as President Tyler issued a proclamation that effectively extended the Monroe Doctrine into the Pacific. The object on both sides was the largest concentration of numbers of people in the world, China. The true Christian, the true Republican, sees the existence of people as the potential for good. Therefore, the more people, the greater the potential for good, and also the greater potential to produce greater wealth. Right? Unleashing the American system in China would mean the death of the British Empire. Plain and simple. And the end, therefore, of oligarchical rule on the planet. Good riddance. So the yellow peril, so-called, is really a yellow blessing, and perceived as such by these people, these Americans. Hiram Bingham envisioned his son, Hiram Bingham Jr., as to be one of the leaders going into China. He said, quote, "I am glad to see your mind turning so readily towards China. It is my view one of the best fields on earth towards which a student can direct his attention and shape his plans in reliance on God. The sciences and Christianity must work together to overthrow the false philosophy and false religion of 250 million of the Chinese," unquote. So Hiram Bingham Jr. did not go to China, but he did go to the U.S. Senate. Senator from Connecticut, and he was responsible for making the Solomon Islands a U.S. territory. His son, Hiram Bingham III, is the one well known for discovering the Inca ruins in Machu Picchu in Peru. Now, Hiram Bingham kept in close contact, even though he was not allowed to go back to Hawaii, with those missionaries who remained there. In particular, Samuel Damon. And this is a picture of Samuel Damon and his wife and one of his sons. And Samuel C. Damon took charge of the Seamen's Bethel in Honolulu in 1842 and served there for 40 years. The Bethel was created by the ABCFM under the direction of Bingham so that to serve sailors, because in 1842 you had about 1,400 sailors, most of them Americans, that would show up in port on a regular basis. Pretty much that was the standard number of people coming in and out. Samuel Damon looked at this and said, what these men need, what any Yankee must have, a newspaper. And he established The Friend, a newspaper, in January 1843, and was proud to bear the title of being the oldest newspaper west of the Rockies. It was the only newspaper west of the Rockies that was published in the Pacific Rim. So every ship that came into harbor in Honolulu, he would row out from shore with a bundle of The Friend, and organize the ship, right, and get this out. Because this was the main source of communication, just like Benjamin Franklin, right, with the publications and transmission of ideas and information throughout the early days of the colonies in America. So he also set up a library in the Bethel, stocked with books, foreign newspapers, and Bibles in various languages. In 1848, Damon had met 10,000 seamen from 10 nationalities in that 1 year, effectively also serving as the postmaster in Honolulu. In 1849, Samuel Damon made his first of many trips abroad. He gave the opening prayer on July 4th, 1849, at Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. And then sailing from San Francisco back to Hawaii, of course this is the height of the gold rush, he wrote his vision for America and the nations of Asia, which he published in The Friend, saying that, for years I have watched the movement of affairs at the islands and throughout the Pacific. I rejoice in having so favorable an opportunity for observing the astonishing changes now transpiring on the west coast of the North American continent. Powerful nations are to be planted. Over the waters of this very bay, now floating the vessel on which I am penning these lines, a vast commerce is soon to pass. The God of nature has so decreed. Cities to vie in magnitude with London and New York must here arise. Here is the wealth. Here tends the tide of immigration. The tide cannot be turned. Unquote. Now, how are these great cities and nations to be built? By 10,000 discoveries in science and improvements in art will make it a new earth. What is this vehicle for what he calls this noble mission for America? America that would, quote, take her stand as the friend of the friendless, the downtrodden, emancipator of the enslaved, and the genuine apostle of human freedom and equality among the nations of the earth, unquote. Now, Samuel Damon and his son Francis would be instrumental in starting the American system revolutions in China and Japan. Now, note here that when we're dealing now with Japan and China, we're dealing with not primitive cultures, but civilizations that have had a continuous history for thousands of years. Now, how did Japan become modern? At this point, Japan had experienced about 500 years of feudalism. Hundreds of years, up to 1800, Japan was held at zero growth population, about 30 million people. They used food control. There was a caste system. There was serfdom. There was widespread infanticide. And there was a prohibition, under threat of death, to travel and trade, particularly outside Japan. So they were isolated from the world. They had very limited resources. 25 years they went from feudalism to being a modern industrial nation. A lot of nations would like to do that today, I can assure you. This is really a test tube case of the success of the American system. Now, central to that development was this man, Manjiro Nakahama, who lived from 1827 to 1898. And he's the fellow on the left. He was known as John Mung to most of the English speakers who knew him. And in January of 1841, at the age of 14, he was shipwrecked along with 4 other Japanese fishermen And he was rescued after 6 months on this small island by a U.S. whaling ship commanded by Captain Whitfield. Now, Manjuro and the other castaways were taken to Honolulu by Whitfield, who then met with his friend, Whitfield's friend, Dr. Jarrett Judd, who was a physician and surgeon who served the ABCFM in Hawaii for 14 years and had become a master of the Hawaiian language. And Judd, this is one of the books that was published on anatomy in Hawaiian that he put together. He later translated a book in Hawaiian on Abraham Lincoln and founded the first medical school for natives. In 1841, he was one of the founders of the Punahou School, which was later called the Oahu College, which Sun Yat-sen would later attend. Now, he resigned from the ABCFM in 1842 to serve as an advisor to the king, Kamehameha III, as translator and president of the Treasury Board. Now, when the Brits seized the Hawaiian government in 1843, Judd took all the crucial documents, government documents, and safe-housed them in the royal crypt and did the government's work by candlelight at night. And afterwards, after the Brits gave up, he was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. He also served as Minister of the Interior, Minister of Finance, and traveled abroad to negotiate treaties. And his lifetime work was on the developing a constitution for Hawaii. And he offered all the Japanese castaways complete financial and material assistance, clothing, housing, and no work was required. And there was no time limit put on how long they wanted to stay there. And 4 of them stayed. Manjuro instead chose to take up an offer made by Captain Whitfield to return with him to Fairhaven, Massachusetts, which he did. He was educated not only in the local school there, but also at a school that taught navigation and surveying, and even shipped out for a year on a whaling voyage. He became a skilled cooper, one of the most valuable people on a whaling ship, that the person who reconstructs the barrels to hold the whale oil. And why was whale oil important? What was it used for? Cooking chitlins? No. It was primarily used for lighting. Right? This is before petroleum, before gas, certainly before electricity. So the primary purpose of going whaling was to harvest whale oil for lighting purposes. So he was an accomplished cooper and navigator. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt writes about how his grandfather, Warren Delano, had told him about this young Japanese boy who went to school in Fairhaven. And his grandfather had been part owner in the ship that Captain Whitfield had navigated on his whaling voyages. So Manjuro became fluent and literate in the English language. He even participated in the California Gold Rush in 1849. Then he was involved in the conspiracy to open up Japan with the Americans. He returned to Hawaii in 1850 in hopes of going back to Japan and met with Sam Damon. Damon saw that this was an opportunity to open Japan with the help of Manjuro as this was the key objective in mind. The plan was to have a U.S. ship drop a small boat off the coast of the Luchu Islands, which are now called Okinawa. Manjuro and the castaways would sail ashore. Damon raised the money for the craft, got a compass and other supplies. Then he got Elijah Allen, who was the U.S. consul in Honolulu, to execute a document giving Manjuro a duly certified a certified document of American citizenship, i.e., he became the first Japanese American. Now here is a map of Japan, and he was dropped off here, the Luchu Islands. This is Okinawa, known as Okinawa today. Now, when Manjuro and 2 others arrived back at their destination in Japan in 1851, they were immediately arrested and interrogated for 70 days. Now, the transcript was kept of the interrogations along with visual drawings. Basically, it was an intelligence report for the shogunate and other Japanese leaders. And it was finally released by the authorities, or he was released by the authorities, Manjiro. 9 months after this report was completed, Manjiro is summoned to the court in Yedo, the capital city here, now called Tokyo. Why? Because U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry had anchored his fleet in the Bay of Yedo. Right. And here's Admiral Perry, born in 1874, died in 1858. This is how he's depicted, one depiction at least, in these what's called the Black Ship scrolls that the Japanese made. Not an inviting rendition of his portrait there. But Perry was the commander. And you've got to understand what's going on here is that the American strategic objective is to develop Japan as a counterbalance to the British in China. That is the driving, overarching strategic objective of the American Republicans. Now, Perry was Commander-in-Chief of U.S. naval forces for East India, China, and the Japanese seas, and he was assigned Special Ambassador to Japan. In 1837, he had supervised the construction of the first naval steamship, the Fulton, and he commanded the African Squadron in 1843 and 44 to suppress the slave trade. In July 8, 1853, Perry, with a squadron of 4 naval ships, arrived with a formal letter from President Millard Fillmore requesting from the Emperor 3 things, basically. One is that there be a change in the ancient Japanese law to allow international commerce through treaties. 2, the safe return of shipwrecked Americans in Japanese waters, because this was a big problem. As quite often these Americans were executed or kept in horrible conditions indefinitely. And number 3, that there be stations for resupply of fuel for American ships, primarily coal, and provisions to resupply those ships. This is one of the Black Scroll paintings of Perry's ships, and they were called the Black Ships, primarily, I believe, because they were using coal, and in addition to sails, and the white canvas didn't stay white too long. You're pumping black smoke out. So, unbeknownst to Perry or the president, there is no emperor. There is a shogun or shogunate who resides in Yedo. Basically, he's the top gang leader of the various factions, families in Japan. The request is denied by the Japanese. Perry says, however, he will leave, but return after he gives them considerable time to reassess the proposal. Now, Perry returns in strength. 7 ships, 3 of them are steamers. He's got 1,600 men. After initial standoff, Perry lands to begin peace and trade agreements. There is no doubt that the Americans are exhibiting something the Japanese have never seen, which is this kind of technology and military force. Now, here you see there's a depiction by one of the people who was on the voyage, William Heine, who made various drawings of the voyage. And the Dutch played a key role in Japan overall, which people should be aware of. In 1635, the Chinese and Dutch traders were allowed to use a limited part of the port of Nagasaki, which is on the far lower west side of the last main island of Japan. And the Dutch was the primary language used for communication with Westerners. Christianity was suppressed. There was a Dutch American with Perry, because the negotiations basically mediated through Dutch interpreters on both sides. Now this is a depiction of the gifts that were given by the United States government to the emperor. There are also various gifts to lower officials. Well, what were these gifts? Here, this is a quarter-size functioning Norris locomotive engine with 2 cars. Norris was the second largest railroad locomotive producer in the United States after Baldwin, also located in Pennsylvania. They brought a mile of track. They made a circle, and they gave rides to some of the shoguns and others on this train. So this is the first functioning railroad in Asia. They brought 2 telegraph sets and 3 miles of telegraph wire. They actually hooked up the wire to the treaty house where the negotiations occurred down to the shoreline so they could communicate to the ships directly with this 1 mile of telegraph wire. Here's an iron-plated stove. This is a water pump, very useful for irrigation. Various agricultural implements, grinding stone for sharpening, like this scythe here. A copper-bottom lifeboat. They'd never seen anything like this. A sewing machine. Magic. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, books. History of the United States. Always good to have. Whiskey, champagne, Madeira wine, various small arms muskets, swords, and 2 mail bags with locks. Now, here's what the Japanese gave in return. 200 bales of rice, 135 pounds each, which they had 93 sumo wrestlers lugged down to the shore and put in the boats. Actually, the Americans got a real kick out of these sumo wrestlers. But so this is why the British were not interested in Japan, because the military costs of occupying Japan far outweigh any looting of Japan. Japan just didn't have the resources. It just was ineffective. You have a military feudal state. Why go there? Push opium to all those Chinese peasants. That's fine. Now, Manjuro, during this period, was kept in seclusion by the Japanese authorities, but everything that was said and written down by the Americans immediately went into this room where he was sequestered, and he translated everything back and forth from the Japanese representatives to Perry, the Americans, and vice versa. So he was doing all the translating. Don't remember what he wrote in the course of, or said that was taken down in his interrogation was, this is what he said about the United States. It has been a long-cherished desire on the part of America to establish friendly relations with Japan and that country, because they believe that the people of the world must live as brothers. So the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed by Perry on March 31st of 1854 and granted all the U.S. requests and effectively began the end of the isolation of Japan. Now Manjuro continued his very important work, actually. He teaches navigation at the new Japanese Naval School. In 1859, he gets the government to set up and establish the National Whaling Enterprise, which he runs. And he compiled and published a book called A Short Cut to English Conversation. He was made a samurai, a lower level, nobility, and given the name of his hometown, Nakahama. And today there actually is an International Manjuro Society. This is the statue in his hometown that looks out to sea, and he's actually got a quadrant in one of his hands. And we'll see a little bit more of what he did in terms of navigation in a bit. A quadrant is a quarter of a circle. It's used to line up the horizon. And anyway, We can talk about that more. This is a picture of Townsend Harris. Right? You get the idea. These missionaries are all young. This guy's not a missionary. He arrives in Japan in 1856, and this is where he was put up. It's a Buddhist temple. They didn't have any. This is the closest thing the Japanese had to Western houses. So generally, what you had, Americans and other visiting dignitaries would stay in the local Buddhist temples. And he becomes the first minister to Japan. And Harris is part of this patriotic pro-union grouping of Democrats based out of New York City, which is where Matthew Perry comes from. And they were close friends. He was also the mentor of David Broderick in New York City. David Broderick, this second-generation Irishman, is the one who comes to California, becomes really the boss of San Francisco, fighting against the vigilantes, the Confederates, becomes the second U.S. senator from the state of California, important guy to keeping the state in the Union, actually is assassinated in a duel, just like the same circumstances that Hamilton died under. And so, looking at another key figure that came in to Japan, this is Dr. James Curtis Hepburn. And he was a doctor and missionary and linguist. He arrived in Yokohama in 1859 as a medical missionary. He opened the first Western medical clinic in Japan in 1861. 6 years later, he issued Japan's first Japanese-English dictionary. In 1887, he issued the Japanese language version of the Bible, and it had a big influence on Japanese culture. There's still the Hepburn method of Romaji, alphabetical expression, in Japan. And yes, he is related to actress Katharine Hepburn. Now, this is an interesting picture which I just found, and had just been discovered last year. This is Reverend Guido Verbeek, and he arrived in Japan the same year as Hepburn in 1859. He's a Dutch-American, born in Holland originally, and he based himself in Nagasaki, which, of course, he spoke Dutch and had easier access to teaching the younger samurai who had already learned some Dutch. And he was hired by the governor there to educate these young samurai who would later become the future leaders in the Meiji Restoration, the major reform that occurred in the 1868-69. And this is him with his son, surrounded by a number of these people will be the key ministers in the Meiji government. And as you can all see, they're wearing their traditional samurai two swords, long and short sword. So they'd have a hard time getting through the metal detectors if they were to go to school here. That's for sure. And one of these people in this picture, I think we have determined, is Okuma, who is a very important guy. Now, Verbeek was also behind the organizing of the 1871 overseas embassy mission of Prince Iwakura. And it was through the Dutch Reform Organization of Frelinghuysen that this was organized, and also through him that, and his connections to Rutgers University, that they were able to get numerous teachers into Japan as well as ex-military officers. They began the process of developing a modern military in Japan. Okay, here you have in 1860, the first delegation of Japanese comes to the United States, representing the Japanese nations to sign the treaty with the Americans. This is a picture on the left here of them in a major parade through New York City. And here meeting with the President Buchanan, who is about to leave office, as Abraham Lincoln will be coming in shortly to fumigate the place. And this is a trade treaty between Japan and the United States. One final thing on Manjiro. This is a picture of Nathaniel Bodwich, and he wrote an important piece on navigation called "The Practical Navigator, Americans for Americans." And it's a huge tome, and it was the Bible that captains and navigators had with them aboard ship. And this was translated into Japanese by Manjiro. It became the Japanese Navigator's Bible. And it was actually given, a copy of it was given by Manjiro to Sam Damon in Honolulu later, who later took it to the Centennial Exhibition, part of the Hawaiian Exhibition, in 1876 in Philadelphia. In Bodwich, it's still used today. It's a whole. Anyway, this is a rendition of the Iwakuru mission leaving to go to not only America but a world tour. And this gentleman here, this is the prince himself. This is Okuma, who is the founder of Japan's first national bank, who you had seen earlier as one of the samurai under Verbeck. And the second from the left is Okubo, who is sometimes referred to as the George Washington of Japan. And Iwakura was the prime minister and creator of Japan's first modern compulsory free educational system. Now, Japan consults. There were several Japanese who were sent as consuls to Washington, D.C. Arinori Mori and Tomita, who worked closely with Henry Carey. And Tomita commissioned Carey's works to be translated into Japanese. Mori returned to Japan to form the sixth year of the Meiji Society, dedicated to the understanding and proliferation of American system economics. In 1871, President Ulysses S. Grant, who would later visit Japan after his presidency, sent a State Department official who was actually an expert in law and also a journalist, one of the leading experts on international law at the time in the United States, by the name of Erasmus Pesheim Smith, to be the official economic advisor to the Meiji Emperor. And he had been a student of Carey, and he served in Japan until 1877. In 1858, he wrote a book that we have in our library here, a manual on political economy, and he becomes the Secretary of State to the Emperor. And he joins Carey's associates working in Japan on mining, on transportation, tariffs, and he instructs Okubo and Okuma on Carey's system of protective tariffs and development of industry. So Okumo founds the first national bank of Japan in 1873, without which Japan could not have industrialized. It is the first nation in Asia to found an independent state bank. This drove the British nuts. The Brits had owned every central bank in Asia, particularly the Hong Kong and Shanghai banks, through which they ran their notorious opium traffic. So the government sponsored whole new industries, and there was no money. And then we could give a class just on how that was done. I'm not going to go through the details now. But whole new industries were created: mining, shipbuilding, chemical industries, and so forth. And these ideas were promoted in the population through these famous woodblocks prints that were made. This is a woodblock depicting Benjamin Franklin and his electricity kite flying experiment. Actually, I don't see it's flying the kite. It's showing the lightning on it and how the electricity is diverted into the ground. Here you see an American couple exhibiting these marvelous new technologies: a sewing machine, an iron, and a watch. This one I really like. This is showing the beginning of the first railroad functioning in 1872 that ran between Yokohama and Tokyo, side by side with the manual labor of the rickshaw. It's actually a train schedule. That's what it is. This is the train station designed by an American in Tokyo. This depicts an American, typical American, playing cello. The dust brush here. This, on the right, is a depiction of the release of these hot air balloons in Washington, D.C. that occurred during the first visit of the Japanese mission that had flags of America and Japan on the balloons. This is a multi-block print that I couldn't even get in, that they're exhibiting downtown now at the National Japanese American Museum, of Yokohama. So Yokohama became, so when Japan opened up, it was still limited just to Yokohama, a small place here for foreigners. Because after the Americans signed treaties, the British were allowed, the Russians and the French to come in, as well, of course, the Dutch as well. So there was trading here, period. But if you look at what's occurred, and here's an older, more modern map, let's say. This shows the railroad running from Yokohama up to Tokyo. It's about 17 miles, something like that. And this is a very large bay. It's a beautiful natural harbor. Now, this is Yokohama today. So Yokohama in 1889 had 120,000 people. Had far less when you saw the earlier picture. Last year, the recorded population of Yokohama was 3.5 million people. Japan, as a whole, in 1872, had about 34.8 million people. And last year, it recorded 120.6 million in the nation. And that is proof of Japan's success, with all the problems included. And there's a few minor problems, like World War II. And you might be interested to know Yokohama, the sister city is in the United States is San Diego. The sister port, what's left of it, is Oakland. And it was, of course, the recipient of some of the first technologies to come into Japan, including, gaslight, the newspaper, international mail, telephone, making bread, milk, brewery, ice cream, making soap, horse racing, baseball, public toilets, and modern water systems, to name a few. This is very interesting, gentlemen. Very important. Fukazawa Yukichi. And he is the most developed philosopher of modern Japan. And you can tell that by reading the first line in his most important work, The Outline of Civilization, published in 1875, which states, "A discourse on civilization is a discourse on the development of the human mind." 1840 to 50s, he comes from a minor samurai family. And from the 1840s to 50s, he pursued his education in the Dutch studies movement in Nagasaki. He actually studied Kepler. And he devoured everything he could on Western civilization. He stated that the intellectuals of Japan at the time had a unique role and responsibility in the history of their nation. That they had the knowledge, on the one hand, of ancient Chinese civilization, and they were the first Japanese to be also exposed to Western civilization. Right? So they were in a unique role. In 1858, Fukazawa founded Keio University, a school on his family estate in Tokyo. It was the first university in Japan. And it was soon staffed by a number of Americans from the Carey School. In 1860, Fukuzawa visits America as part of this first embassy trip on a ship that Manjuro was also on. And they're proud of the fact that they went through like 30 days of storm and navigated the ship by themselves. And he's also got a sense of humor, because he talks later about, in his autobiography, about how he had no fear at all during all these storms crossing the Atlantic in the ship. But once he got into San Francisco and he was in a social situation with Westerners and women, he felt like a bride. So it was quite funny. So he never joined the government. I mean, he held a minor position early, but he did not participate directly in the government. He worked to found schools, universities. He started the first Japanese newspaper, Jiji Shinpo, in 1871, and the sales of his books just were devoured by the public, Japanese public. So he actually made money, which was a new concept in Japan, and he became independent. And he takes on the feudal system. He said, forget about establishing colleges of higher learning. You can't teach serfs, higher learning. The first thing you have to do is teach them the idea of freedom. Without that, there is nothing. And his writing on education is monumental. And his influence of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, you can see in his encouragement of learning in 1872, where he says, quote, heaven never created a man above another, nor a man below another, it is said. Therefore, when men are born, heaven's idea is that all men should be equal to all other men without distinction of high or low or noble and mean, but that they should all work with body and mind, with dignity worthy of the lords of creation, which they are, in order to take all things in the world for the fulfillment of their needs in clothing, food, and dwelling, freely but without obstructing others, so that each can live happily through life. He clearly states his political objective in his autobiography, right at the end. He states, I must take advantage of the moment to bring in more of Western civilization and revolutionize our people's ideas from the roots. Then, perhaps, it would not be impossible to form a great nation in this far Orient, which would stand counter to Great Britain of the West, and take an active part in the progress of the whole world. So I have led on to form my second and greater ambition. I should like to encourage a religion, Buddhism or Christianity, to give peaceful influence on a large foundation created for the study of higher sciences in both physical and metaphysical fields, unquote. So the failure in Japan is that there was not a philosophical revolution. The one that Fukuzawa had the insight to recognize and identify and actually pose a solution to. Hence, you had the intervention of the British and their manipulative operations, beginning with Sir Harry Parkes in particular after the Civil War. Because you've got to understand there's a certain cessation of Americans' influence in trying to modernize Japan because of a thing called the American Civil War. It occurred in 1860 through 64. So the attention for the Americans, as well as the British, because they wanted to destroy the Union above all else. That was their strategic objective. So Asia took a minor role in terms of priorities for Lincoln and the Americans as a whole. But after the Civil War, the British came into Japan in a big way. As I mentioned, Sir Harry Parkes in 1865. Now, he is the same guy he was involved in the treaty operations for the British in Bangkok, Thailand. He cut his teeth in the Opium Wars, representing the British government in Canton during the Second Opium War. And he set up an Japanology operation, as it was called, in the British consulate to study Japanese history and profile the Japanese population, which all good Japanese consulates do. That's their job. They profile British, and they learned this from the French, will know, for instance, in Persia, they will know every single town in that nation. They will know how many people are Muslims and of what sect in every single town. Same in India. They know how to manipulate people, and that's because they've got them profiled. Right? That's how they conceive of controlling the population. So they just set up the same kind of operation, which we need to look more at. The two key Japanologists coming out of the consulate there, who became famous afterwards, Sir Ernest Sato. He became the UK minister in Peking, China, from 1900 to 1906, and then a member of the Privy Council of the Queen, King, and William George Aston. And Aston and Sato became, still to this day, famous Japanologists on the history of Japan. So what do you have following this is Japan's involvement with a war in China in 1894, nominally over Korea. Within 20 years, they have a war with Russia. And in the 1820s, the British manipulation into World War II. And the Japanese occupation and atrocities against the Chinese, which were notorious as part of that. There was no understanding of a Treaty of Westphalia. Right? This is a failure. The last thing I want to discuss in terms of the missions is, well, actually there's two more. First is Siam. And this is a map of Indochina. Originally called Siam, it stretches from here over and around. It's what we call Thailand today. The name was changed in 1949. Thai means freedom, so land of the free. And what's that?
Who named it that?
I don't know. Maybe Lex knows. I mean, their history going back, they were to 3,600 BC, probably the oldest bronze culture on the earth. You had Chinese migration in the 7th century BC, Indian migration 300 years later. So you have the influence of Hindu and Sanskrit, which becomes the basis for the language in Siam. Yeah.
What was the Bronze Age?
3600 BC. In more modern period, Siam signed a treaty with Portugal in 1516, treaty with Spain in 1601, and they signed a treaty with the United States in 1833, 20 years before the British, though the British were skulking around in Bangkok already. This is a picture of the two most important people responsible for the development of Siam as a modern nation. At the time, in the mid-century 1800s, 1850s, Siam had 5.5 million people. They have over 64 million people today. The person on the left is not the American. This is King Mungka, also known as Rama IV. At age 12, he was put in charge of the army of Siam. At age 20, his father died, and his brother became king. And he became a Buddhist monk for 27 years. And he had an avid pursuit for scientific knowledge. He became a Buddhist scholar. And at that time, Buddhism had died in Siam. He sent emissaries out to Sri Lanka, what's called Sri Lanka today, Ceylon, to learn the history of the authentic teachings of Buddhism. And he revolutionized the Siamese language and Siamese Buddhism. He spoke English, French, Pali, Malay, and Sanskrit. And he joked with some Englishmen once that they have not understanding of their own language when I speak. He established the Dhamma sect of Buddhism. At that time, before his intervention, priests were merely reciting the Pali language liturgy at temple, while they and others didn't even know what was being said. That's a page out of Rufus Anderson's approach to teaching religion. So what Mungut did is he made Pali knowable, made it a written and oral language, and they used the printing press supplied by the Americans to do it. In 1851, his brother dies and he becomes king. And King Mungut's continuing education went on with Latin with the local bishop, Pelagua, and the American Reverend Dr. Dan Beach Bradley, the person you see on your right. And both men were Thai language scholars and published Thai dictionaries. I'm going to refer to Siam as Thailand from now on. And King Mungut issued a series of edicts on the Thai language to elevate the ability to transmit ideas amongst the population. Were printed by Bradley. This is an older map of the region, and I hope you can see the distinctions in color. Maybe they're not quite that clear. But when he became king, Thailand was under assault by the European imperialists who wanted Thailand as a colony. You had the British on the north who were pressing down from India, which is Bangladesh today, down into Burma, down to here, and up from the south, from Malaysia. Right? The British wanted to control this, of course, because the Malacca Straits is where the majority of all shipping goes. It goes from the Indian Ocean up to the China Sea. And France, you had Napoleon III running France, and the French are pressing into Siam from the south and from the east. And Siam does make some concessions to the French at certain points, giving up some of the territory. So Mungut started corresponding with world leaders to defend Thailand's independence, including Queen Victoria, Good Luck, the Pope, and Abraham Lincoln. Now, Reverend Dr. Dan Bradley is a very interesting guy. He was a minister and medical doctor. He was deployed by the ABCFM to Thailand. He arrived in 1835, and he was the best of Western Augustinian Christian civilization. And when he arrived, there were no newspapers, there were no books in Thailand, there was no literacy among the general population, and no Western medicine. He introduced Western medicine, set up a clinic with his wife, and they treated 100 to 150 patients every day, generally for eye diseases transmitted by water, 2,000 prescriptions a month. And he became the physician to the royal family. He kept a mechanical model of the solar system in his clinic as a pedagogical for his patients to explain how the solar system functioned. And 1838, he introduces the inoculation against the widespread disease of smallpox, much like Cotton Mather had done earlier. And he's involved in fighting various epidemics. He establishes the first hospital in 1843, the first printing press and bindery as well. He published a treatise on smallpox vaccination, and in 1939 printed the royal edict against the importation of opium into Thailand. 1844, he begins publishing and editing Thailand's first newspaper, the Bangkok Recorder. Yes. Talking about this fellow here on the right, Dr. Reverend Dan Beach Bradley, the American missionary. And so he also published books and pamphlets on history, on the Thai language, also on Lincoln and the Civil War in support of the Union when that started. And Mungut bought a printing press through him. And he introduced European classical music to Thailand for the first time, as well as other educational initiatives. Bradley. Also, the Industrial Revolution came in with the help of his friend, fellow missionary, John Hassett Chandler, who arrived in Bangkok in 1843. He's a machinist and a printer, and he taught the Thais how to organize a machine shop, taught them science, mechanics, built Thailand's first steamboats, and imported steam engines for various power sources for various other machines. Now, from 1847 to 50, Bradley is expelled from Thailand because of these scumbags back in Boston who don't want him fiddling around the frontiers of the empire by the Boston Brahmin drug pushers. Particularly this guy Pickering, who's one of these characters from Boston. Now, Bradley returned under his own initiative. He raised the money, went back to Bangkok on his own. And he returned when Mongkut became king. And he worked on, they became friends. They worked on scientific experiments together. They worked closely with Townsend Harris, who is the U.S. representative from the United States to Thailand, signs the treaty in 1856 between the United States and Thailand. Of course, supported Lincoln in the Union, and Mongkut wrote Lincoln and after the Civil War started and offered to send elephants to help the Union. Lincoln was gracious enough to answer saying, "We don't have the climate to support elephants. We're too far north. Thank you very much." Right? And Sarah Bradley, his wife, taught English to the royal family. He also taught music and led in concerts, and both their sons were expert pianists. They began performing Handel's Messiah around 1855, which they now do daily, or not daily, yearly, to this day, as an annual event in Bangkok. Now, King Mongkut died in 1868 as he lived, committed to science. He predicted a solar eclipse and took an entourage south on barges into the swamps of southern Thailand to observe it. And his prediction was more accurate than any European. Unfortunately, he and his 15-year-old son contracted malaria, and he died. Though his son survived, known as King Rama IV, and carried on his father's work to modernize Thailand as fast as possible. Now, Dan Bradley and Townsend Harris are both honored as heroes in Thailand who helped defend the independence of Thailand and modernize the nation. Bradley is honored in their national museum. Harris is known and respected in Japan, but neither of them are known to Americans today. Why? The British, of course, and their American-born Anglophile allies. Americans don't know Dan Bradley, but they know Hollywood movies. The King and I, and the recent film with Jodie Foster, Anna and the King. Right? People are familiar with these? Well, those films were based on the scribblings of a lying British bitch by the name of Anna Leonowens, who was a widow of a British officer who died in India, and she found temporary employment teaching English in King Mongkut's harem. She wrote that Mongkut, quote, was a fickle and petulant as he was, suspicious and cruel, claiming that he had burned a monk for committing adultery at the stake. Not committing adultery at the stake, but burned at the stake for committing adultery. And they had forced disobedient concubines into a dungeon underneath the royal palace. Of course, there's no dungeon under the palace because it would be underwater because it was by the river. She never taught the royal family. She never met the king. Mongkut mentions her only once in passing in his daily journals. Yet she claims that she, not the Bradleys, were the liberating influence on King Mongkut. She later wrote several books that were complete fabrications about the king in Siam, the most famous being Anna and the King of Siam. Now, if you were to go down to Blockbuster and buy a copy of The King and I and take it to Bangkok, you could very well... You're in trouble. It's against the law to possess the book, the videotapes, the DVDs of these films. It is illegal. Even the producers of Anna and the King, these enlightened boomers, tried to film in Thailand. And they submitted the script to the government, and they revised it a number of times, and they said, this is just trash. Get out of here. So they didn't film it in Thailand. So, you've briefly heard an outline of the education and the accomplishments of King Munga. And you can now be the judge of why the Thai government considers this to be a bunch of lying, disgraceful trash. We're going to see a few short clips from the 1956 film The King and I, starring Yul Brynner, which was the musical version of the earlier film with Rex Harrison. Imagine such a film was made by about Abraham Lincoln. Now, if I can figure out how to do this, I can.
Get your mouse finger going there.
Mark, the son of Munga,
Yeah.
is he the one that they call King on the High?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Remember that bit?
Letter? Now?
No, when else I was always that time. Take letter to Mr. Lincoln of America, who is very scientific ruler.
Very well, Your Majesty.
From Kamehameha. By the blessing of the highest super agency in the world of the whole universe, the King of Siam, sovereign of all tributary countries adjacent and around in every direction, etc., 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 to his royal presidency of the United States in America, Abraham Lincoln, etc. You pick up. It has occurred to us. You see, it has occurred to us
Your head has to be lower than
It has occurred to us that we shall be sending you several pairs of young male elephants to be turned loose in forests of America, America. We are of opinion that after a while they shall increase in number, and inhabitants of America shall be
Your
able to...
Majesty,
Well,
I don't think you mean pairs of male elephants.
how can I make clever if you interrupt? And inhabitants of America shall be able to catch and tame them, and use them as beasts of burden.
Only male elephants, Your Majesty?
You put on the details. Good night.
1, 2, 3, and shall we dance
1, 2, 3,
on the bright cloud of music? Shall we fly?
1, 2, 3, and
Shall we dance?
1, 2, 3, and
Shall we then say good night and mean goodbye?
1, 2, 3, and
Oh,
perchance, when those last little stars will leave the sky,
shall we still be together with our arms around each other? And shall you be my new romance? On the clear understanding that this kind of thing can happen.
shall we dance? Shall we dance?
Shall we dance? Now,
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Something wrong.
Something wrong indeed. How do I get rid of it?
Let's do what I did, but backwards.
I hit escape. Anyway, my father's generation loved that kind of schmaltz. And we can't show too much of it, especially to young minds. It'd be dangerous to your health. So, we want to move on. Oops, wrong way. Here we go. We're going to conclude by looking at Hawaii briefly and some reality.
Hawaii?
That's right. Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And This is a truly golden soul, not just for Asia, but for the world. And he stated that the two principal influences that shaped his life were, one, Christianity, and two, the ideas of the founding of the United States of America. And these are exemplified by his three principles of the people, which are modeled on Abraham Lincoln. Both of those influences came from what he learned initially in Hawaii. And Sun Yat-sen was born about a year or so after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, around 1866 or 67, in a small village on the Pearl River Delta in the Guangdong province. And about the age of 11, he was sent to live with his brother, Sun Mei, who ran a prosperous general store on the shore of Pearl Harbor in Honolulu. And he became one of the wealthiest Chinese in Hawaii, relatively. It's a relative term, wealthiest. But Sun attended Iolani College, which was run by an Episcopal bishop, British, and he excelled in the English language. Queen Emma actually came to graduation and presented him with a Bible as a gift for his good works, but Bishop Willis was an anti-American monarchist who later denounced Sun Yat-sen when Sun became a revolutionary. But this nurtured his interest in Christianity at being at this school, and he learned a lesson there about being a revolutionary, because he had no shoes. And he said, all the boys of China should have shoes. So should I. This was a revelation that occurred in the bishop's school. But he was impressed by the laws of Hawaii and the racial harmony as a young man, which he knew was a product of the American influence. He then attended Oahu College, which was founded by Dr. Judd, who we mentioned earlier, and these American ideas strengthened his beliefs in Christianity. And he told his brother he wanted to become a Christian. He immediately sent him back to China. And he, returning to China in his small village, when people were going to the temple, he just couldn't take it anymore. He went up and he tore off the arm of a statue of the god of autumn and demanded of his family and other people in the village, why do you kneel before this idol? He can't protect you. He can't even protect himself. Well, this didn't go too well with Mom and Pop, so they sent him to Hong Kong to continue his studies, and it was there that he converted to Christianity by an ABC-FM Reverend Dr. Charles Hager, and he starts converting his friends, and he makes no distinction between converting them to Christianity and the Revolution. In 1886, he returned to his brother in Hawaii, and his brother threatened to disinherit him. He wanted to give him half his business if he didn't stop being a Christian. And this is where Sun Yat-sen meets this gentleman, Reverend Frank Damon, who is the son of Samuel Damon, who headed up the Bethel and published the Friend newspaper. Now, Francis Damon became a close friend of Sun Yat-sen and his family, and he was a key supporter of the Chinese Revolution. In 1876, he went to Europe, and he was secretary of the Hawaiian legation in Berlin from 1878 to 80. He considered devoting himself to just the study of philology. He was fluent in 8 languages and studied Sanskrit in India. And returning to Hawaii, he stopped on his way in Canton to visit a Reverend Happer, and wanting to perfect his Chinese, met with his daughter Mary, who was fluent since she had grown up there, and she would become his future wife. Back in Hawaii, the first thing he did was go to the Chinese communities, and he was appalled by their living conditions, and he worked to ensure that entire Chinese families emigrated to Hawaii, not just the males, which was the case, as we know, that happened in California, for instance. So he also established the Free Kindergarten Association, children's school, and the first Christian boarding house for Oriental boys. The Hawaiian Board of Missions appointed him superintendent of the Chinese mission from beginning in 1884, and he served in that position until 1915. Now, Damon encouraged Sun Yat-sen to continue his studies and his faith in Christianity. When Sun Yat-sen wanted to return to China to study medicine, it was Damon that raised the money for the trip. And Sun did become a medical doctor. One of his instructors, Dr. James Calney, who taught Sun Yat-sen, he befriended him. He later saved Sun Yat-sen when he had been captured by Manchu kidnappers in London in 1896. Now, Honolulu is the birthplace of the Kuomintang, the Revolutionary Party of China. This is a montage. Part of this is from my article here, but this is a young depiction of Sun Yat-sen, probably around the age of 18, still wearing his queue, which is a sign of subservience to the emperor. Part of being a revolutionary is to cut off your queue, your ponytail. And this is the old church Bethel of Sam Damon. This is Sun Yat-sen and his family, which he brought to Hawaii. And this is the building in which the first meeting of the revolutionary organization occurred that Sun Yat-sen started, 1884. And he went there to Hawaii to organize this political movement and to fundraise for the capabilities to create a revolution and overthrow the Manchu dynasty. So on November 24th, in 1884, 30 Chinese met with Sun Yat-sen and established the Sing Chung Hui, the Revival of China Society. They put their left hand on the Bible, right hand raised to heaven, and they pledged themselves to, quote, overthrow the Manchus, the restoration of China to the Chinese, and the establishment of a republican government, unquote. And this was the beginning of the what became the Kuomintang Party. Members could be foreign, but they had to pay their dues, $5. Stock was sold in the Revolution at $10 to be returned at $100 after the Revolution. And they started their own newspaper. Reverend Frank Damon suggested that the society take up military training. And a Dutch captain, Victor Bache, began military drill instruction twice a week. They used wooden rifles and they drilled on the lawn of Frank Damon. Now, many of the leaders of the revolution in China and the First Republic, actually the leaders, came from Hawaii, including, for instance, the commander of the First Chinese Republic's Air Force. And people have probably seen this picture before. This is Chinese troops that were trained here in Los Angeles in Eagle Rock as part of the Western Military Academy that was set up in Los Angeles. They were trained by veterans of the Philippine Wars and revolts. And this goes, well, there's a long story behind that, from a very high level in the military to train the Chinese, the chief of staff, in fact. So Los Angeles became part of the revolution led by Sun Yat-sen. There is the success, of course, in 1911, but that is soon lost when he resigns there's the appointment of a man named Juan, who becomes totally corrupt and a dictator. And so there is a reorganization to have a new revolution, to overthrow this dictator who has usurped the power of the republic. And one of the things that Sun Yat-sen does is go back to Japan, and Japan is a very important base of operations for launching the first revolution and subsequent attempts by Sun Yat-sen, and he has friends there. And he issued during World War I, the British tried to get China to join the so-called Allies against Germany. Japan did join. China did not. Sun Yat-sen refused, and he wrote a pamphlet called The Vital Problem of China, which we have published ourselves in Chinese. And I've just found my copy in English, which we'll put up on the website as soon as we can. In addition to other of his writings at this period of time, including a letter he sent to Okuma in 1914, where he urges Japan to support the Chinese Revolution because it is in the interests of China and Japan. That's extremely important. And we have to look more at that. But what he says in The Vital Problem of China is he analyzes the problems of colonialism and warned that the British... Let me see if I got the right quote here. There it is. Basically, Sun Yat-sen refused to allow China, at least his leadership role, to join with the British. Unfortunately, I can't find that quote, but what he says in a very poetic way is that the British have no friends. Oh, here it is. Here it is. Britain seeks friendship only with those who can render her services, and when her friends are too weak to be of any use to her, they must be sacrificed in her interests. Britain's tender regard for her friends is like the delicate care usually shown by farmers in the rearing of silkworms. After all the silk has been drawn from the cocoons, they are destroyed by fire or used as food for fish. The present friends of Britain are no more than silkworms, and they receiving the tender care of Britain simply because there is still some silk left in them. An analysis of the acts of British statesmen reveals that they never speak the truth. Right? So we see that Sun Yat-sen was acting on the highest universal principles expressed in the American Revolution, often against Americans, including presidents, who abandoned and were treasonous against those principles, such as Teddy Roosevelt and particularly Woodrow Wilson. So in conclusion, I want to quote from Lyndon LaRouche's paper on the coming Eurasian world. Therefore, the thesis to be pursued now is this: imposition of standards of cultural sanity is not tyranny, is not the cause of the problems of Asia today. The chief source of corruption in Asian culture today is the attempt to rival the present forms of cultural decadence prevalent in European culture's leading circles of today. The kind of corruption of Asian culture, combined with the hatred engendered through the grievances caused by European abuses, tends to prevent the cultures of Asia and Africa from discovering the deeper roots of their present problem with Asian or African culture itself. On this account, Asian patriots must study the history of European civilization more carefully to see what universal principles are demonstrated for both European and Asian cultures today. By tracing the internal struggles between right and wrong in European history, down to the epistemological roots of that conflict, this must be done for the purpose that Asia might not repeat in its own way the kind of folly which sent ancient classical Greece down to its own self-inflicted defeat. Lin has also made a provocative statement, several places, I think elsewhere, where he attacks the idea of the lack of monotheism in Asia in general. Of course, the Koreans won't have a problem with that. But, and there's a problem because it comes up because of if you have a polytheistic outlook, it prevents the ability to form universal principles. Now, can you generate a universal scientific principle in a culture which believes in more than one universe? A culture which has 8 million gods? As the Japanese would say. The problem we must face and solve with Asian culture is not new. Plato faced the same problem, because in the Greece he was living in was polytheistic. And there was a failure to address and solve that problem. So we need to examine, I think it's very fruitful to examine the lectures of Sun Yat-sen and the Three Principles of the People. We're going to put that on the website as soon as we can too. Because here is a man who, he attacks the shortcomings of the West. He does not have a problem with that. He attacks the Americans at that time, saying that the failure of American government is that it denies the greatest happiness for its citizens because of its corruption. And he fuses the best of Chinese culture with the ideas of Western civilization, actually beautifully using Mencius and Plato. And it's well worth reading. If you're going to have a dialogue of cultures, you've got to read Sun Yat-sen. This is a real beautiful soul. Has been returned. So we're going to put it on the web, at least these lectures, as soon as we can. So the central idea, the modernization of the West via science and technology was a direct corollary of the idea over the battle of the nature of man that's embodied in the American Revolution, represented in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. There was never any separation of science and religion in the mind of those, like Benjamin Franklin, who led both of those revolutions. Those ideas were unified in their identity, exactly as it was with Sun Yat-sen or Lyndon LaRouche today. It is that identity as an individual capable of understanding and acting upon universal principles which allows that person to be an instrument for the development of the noosphere, a true revolutionary, generating a higher principle of the universe. As Sun Yat-sen said in his will, and as Lyndon LaRouche has reminded us, the work of the revolution is not yet done. And that I conclude what I have to say about this history. But I think it's important, if you're going to grapple with this idea, you have to have some sense of the history that has come before, that has shaped what we're dealing with today. And most Americans just don't have that basing. I think our members have at least got to have that. So Frankie? You can turn on the lights if you want. Actually, I found one. Sorry.
Is the history of this history known? Like you look at the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Is it still known today what actually caused and pushed this, or the history we know is Sun Yat-sen? I mean, I know that there are people studying him in China are looking at Sun Yat-sen from the looking glass of LaRouche, but do they recognize the significance and the relationship that he does have to the American Revolution? I mean, the current Chinese government, do they promote him, or does the current Taiwanese government promote him?
Well, the current Taiwanese government, Taiwanese government historically has. Mm-hmm. They've published a lot of stuff. And there's some secondary problems about that, but generally in the mainland, no. And it's because of LaRouche that it's being reintroduced and discussed again. There's not two separate things. Without LaRouche, there wouldn't be taking up of these ideas again. You can't underestimate the impact that our book on the vital problem of China and Chinese has had. It caused an explosion when it was released by leaders in Taiwan who said no, don't care. And, Chiang Kai-shek's son had a disagreement about that. So there were other leaders who said, this is perfect, right? At least had some insight historically as to the necessity of articulating the problem, which is what Sun Yat-sen does in that book. He identifies the British, their modus operandi, how they operate, how to solve the problem. There's this beautiful letter I just read that he wrote to Okuma on the necessity of Japan joining with China, with him specifically, to do what? Not just to put him back in power, but to restore the revolution in China so that Japan can restore the principles of the reform which it had lost. That both their nations, their existence and their extinction are linked. Right? And he goes through this beautifully. He goes through economically how it can be done. Right? How the British, where does the power of the British come from? They're just a couple of islands out in the Atlantic. It comes from their ownership of India, right? Where they're able to extract the wealth, which is then in turn is extracted through opium in China and so on. He said, well, look, the Japanese, we have these raw materials. We don't have access to it because we don't have the technology, but it won't be that expensive for us because we don't have to supply money and resources for troops and military in the interior of China. So he lays out an exposition of trade relations with Japan if he's put back into power, basically. Right? If his ideas that he represents are backed and put into power, that this will change Asia and the world. It's a really beautiful letter that he wrote. That's the kind of mind he represents. And he obviously addresses the failure of Japan to not support him initially to begin with, and getting into the militarism. They succumb to the militarists, which is the manipulation of the British, taking advantage of that, promoting it, so they can kill each other. And he's very direct, saying if we don't solve this problem, it's going to get really nasty. And it did. So you have to look at the failures, not just the positive effects. So I don't know. My understanding is that these statements by LaRouche on Asian culture had some provocation with amongst their own members.
What were the three principles that Sun developed?
The three principles that are on the nation, the independence of the nation, on the economy, and the nationalism. Let's see if he identifies. Often they're mistranslated, either by the communists or the Taiwanese. Often the economy is translated into socialism, nationalism, democracy, and livelihood. This is the three categories that he gives a series of lectures on.
What, livelihood?
Livelihood, the economy.
You wrote a little bit more into Cherokee. How did that fit in with the missionaries? How it was handled?
Well, how it fit into it is because it shows two things. One, politically, that the British always, and they learned this from the French who were doing it successfully, is to use the native populations as a marcher lord against Western colonization. And that's the case. You look at the Iroquois. I mean, we did have one tribe that fought with the American Revolutionaries. The rest were on the British side. Right? And they were being supplied with Sheffield steel-made tomahawks. And this is always the case. You know, the use of Native Americans by the colonial powers, be they French or the British, against Western expansion. Why? The British don't want a republic of god-awful things to extend to both oceans. This is why they were so concerned with the West Coast, of what would have happened there. Not simply having a base of military operations, but to hem in the United States, not allowing them access to the Pacific. So that's strategically one side of it, the necessity of doing it. But the other side is, what was their approach to the Native Americans? Not to treat them like a bunch of cattle, right? But to actually figure out, how do you modernize these people? How do you make them literate? And they proved that the best way to do that is to teach the native population their own written language. And then it just accelerates the learning process to whatever language is the main language where they're living, whether it's French or Spanish or English. It just accelerates the learning process. So you want to do that, and they succeeded in doing it. And so it demonstrates, their approach is distinct from the British, whose idea of Indians was to either kill them or use them to kill other people, which is generally their foreign policy anyway. Right? And Indians didn't make very good slaves. They weren't obedient. They weren't submissive. So kill them, like Andrew Jackson did. We knew that. It's a tragedy. You got to understand, a lot of what's put out as history today is just to lump everything into one category. It tends to be very racist. Just the white man's here to steal the land, kill the Indian. What's new? That kind of thing. It's not. It was a battle. The ideas of the unique revolution that occurred in the American Revolution, the first time this had ever occurred in history, was a continual battle over these ideas. Just because somebody is born in America after it becomes a republic doesn't mean they're going to be Republicans. Right? It's a continual internal battle over these same ideas, like today. There's a lot of stupid people out there that think Bush is not so bad. Or, believe in a lot of stupid things. They have many gods, many false gods. Millions of gods. They're all shaped like dollar bills. And this is the paganism we have to deal with. It's materialism. And the fundies are the worst. They're absolutely the worst. But you see the problem with the fundies today, so-called Christianity, is not predicated on these ideas that Mather and then his missionaries represented. Right? What their idea of Christianity was not, I believe. No. You had to have content and principle and acts that went with it, or they were nothing. Today, all you have to do is sign the deal with God, Your credit card's extended, your credit, and you're one of the chosen, and you get in. And that, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. It's all based on belief, and nothing that can be proven. I mean, that's what Lynn says about Christianity, with the several, key exceptions like the Immaculate Birth. He wants to be able to prove Christianity, to prove it as a scientific principle. That's what we're really talking about, as a scientific principle, not just a belief system. Right? There's something important going on here. What is it? This is the importance of the Trinity. It conveys a certain conception about the idea of man, your identity. Again,
well, I don't know. What about the Immaculate Birth? I mean, you've had a little bit of time to think about this, and this is something that is, I don't know, like an integral feature of, quote unquote Christianity. So I don't know just what your thoughts are on how to understand that.
No more than I just said. That's an article of faith. The other side is these insane British Israelites, sort of Masons, who believed that Christ, had a relationship with Mary Magdalene, and they had a son, and then blah blah blah, and the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and which is just the flip side of saying that Jesus is just a man, just another Slav. Right? He's an important Slav. And he's got that royal blood, right, that I can trace down to my family lineage. It's crazy. That's not the point. The point is the concept is the idea. It starts with the word.
Is this where because we were working on history and we came across on the term divine rights of kings? I mean, is this what, I don't know, what you just said right now, where the British saying that Mary Magdalene, Jesus, and all blah 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 blah, but I really don't understand where that thing came from.
Well, basically, you have a bunch of street gangs. Right? And the gang that finally gets to rule the turf, he's the head of the gang. He's the head of the chief. Right? And the more loot you get, the bigger your influence. You might become a king. And of course, the important thing is to hand down your loot to your immediate family members. You might not even like it, but you're creating, that's your idea of immortality, handing down money or loot. and this is a basic basis of the feudal system. It goes back to Rome. It goes back to Babylon. It's based on, it's what we call the oligarchical system today, which is based on families, powerful families, who have mutual and sometimes divergent interests. Their mutual interest is the continuation of that system of families ruling an empire. Right? And it reached a certain fine-tuning with the Venetian model, right? Where you had the Doge, and you had, even the Doge could be replaced. That was the model that became active in Britain, where the king might be a supreme ruler, as distinct from the divine right earlier, that the king could be removed. Removed how? Because it's by the families. So you don't have absolute rule. You have rule by basically a council of leading gang members of different clans. And that's how it rules. That's what rules. It's not ruled by any abstract law or natural law or what have you. It's arbitrary. So you have a certain system that came out of the collapse of the Roman Empire, which was a continuation of these ruled by the families, certain families, for the most part. And so that's where this divine right and the stratification of the population, the serfs, and it was really horrendous in the Byzantine Empire, or worse than the Western Empire, where it was just a fixed idea of the universe. That in fact, the head of the church was also the emperor. But if you were a person who was a mender of souls, made sandals, your son would make sandals, your grandson would make sandals, until the end of the universe. And that's the way it worked. And so it was very fixed. That's not how the universe is organized. It's not fixed. Right? But that's where this divine right of kings comes in, of the absolute authority of the head of the gang. In fact, it reminds me of one debate that King Mungat once called Dan Bradley to the palace at 2 a.m. in Bangkok. But they wanted to discuss idolatry. And Dan Bradley goes on, graven images and so on and so on. And then King Mungat says, well, what about this new statue of Prince Albert that just was unveiled by Queen Victoria in London, where you have all these people bowing down. And Bradley says, well, I got to admit, you won this debate. So have people get more of a background to this history, because it's important. This is where the greatest mass of people live, in this Pacific Rim. I was in New Federalist in '89. I can get you probably run you off a copy on the machine. I don't have too many copies of it left. People like the movie?
How is the Thai response movie?
The Thai response movie? The one that came out recently?
Yeah.
It's
illegal. Big trouble.
No, he's talking about the movie the Thais made about the truth about Thai history. The one, isn't it the one you got recently?
That one that he got. That is sponsored by the Thai government, actually by the Queen. It's kind of a partial sports legend and a partial history. I guess she kind of put it all together as a way of getting to the people about Thai history, of where it came from and what it is and how it came about. Kind of have to understand, in Thailand, especially out in the further outskirts area, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in Thailand. granted, Bangkok itself very heavily populated. Infrastructure, as far as getting from one place to another, is pretty difficult, except for the monorail system that is above ground. Water sewer system is still not exactly drinkable. So, you know, and when you get to the outer suburban areas, they got nothing out there. They don't have water. They don't have power. So I guess the movie was kind of a response to try to keep the people that are not really educated to at least know something of it.
Right. That Marty actually copied it and for educational purposes to be made available. Yeah. Okay.